"You think I won't dare? Scum, like you belong under my feet," the officer shouted as he kicked the black man straight in the stomach while he curled up on the side of the street. He didn't know that kick had been caught on video from an angle he couldn't control the conscience of a witness. 3 days later, the name Micah Rourke shook the entire police force. And the officer, he was treated like a beast wearing the mask of justice. Early in the morning, the sun hadn't yet burned away the cold rising from the pavement, but Micah Rourke had been sitting at that corner for a long time. He leaned against a rusty streetlight pole, knees pulled tight to his chest to hold on to what little warmth his tattered jacket still offered. In his arms, he clutched a crumpled paper bag with half a loaf of bread from the day before, left hand gripping the thin plastic handle like it might vanish if he let go. His eyes weren't searching anymore, not for direction, not for family, not for judgment. He only looked down at the worn heels of his shoes and blinked slowly when the sharp sound of leather soles hit the sidewalk in front of him. Troy Halberd didn't walk. He advanced like a hunter who had spotted his prey from a distance. His uniform was pressed to an unnatural stiffness, but it was the way he drew the baton from his belt mid-stride that made the air tighten. He stopped in front of Micah without a word. No question, no explanation. He gritted his teeth, shifted his weight, and slammed the baton down onto the pavement right by Micah's feet. The crack rang out dry and sharp like a warning. "Get up, you're dirtying this neighborhood." Micah didn't jump to his feet, didn't lower himself with apologies. He looked up with eyes already used to the scent of threat. "I didn't break any law," he said calmly, not questioning, not resisting, but not bowing either. Halbert laughed, not because he heard something absurd, but because he'd been waiting for that line like a green light to act. "Around here, I'm the law," he said, enunciating every word, and without pausing, he raised his right leg and kicked Micah straight in the stomach. The kick landed squarely. It hit Micah's abdomen hard enough to make him fold instantly, the paper bag flying from his hands, rolling across the rough pavement. He curled inward, writhing, clutching his midsection jaw, clenched to trap the groan, fighting its way out. Halbert stood over him, eyes gleaming with satisfaction like someone who had just put an out-of-place object back where it belonged in the world he believed was his. He didn't know that across the street the glass window of a barber shop had reflected the entire scene. The early sun wasn't bright enough to illuminate everything, but it caught a flicker on the glass. Something had moved. Halbert hadn't noticed yet, but in a shaded corner a figure held up a phone and the camera had started recording. No voice, no calling out, no shouting, just a gaze locked on Halbert, cold and sharp, like a blade kept hidden. Micah gasped for air, still unable to sit up. He didn't ask why. He'd been pushed out of a train station before just for sitting too close to an ATM. He'd been dragged from park benches for having a human smell. He'd been threatened with arrest for not getting a haircut. But this morning's kick was the first thing that made him feel truly cold, not from the pain, but because Halbert kicked him like it was his natural right, a right fed by the silence of every witness who had ever stood by and done nothing. Halbert glanced around, then bent down to pick up the torn bag at his feet and flung it at Micah. "Take your trash and get out of here before I call a car." But then he froze. For a brief second, sunlight through the glass window across the street bounced back, an image of himself, baton raised, kick, extended eyes full of contempt. He frowned. "Someone there," he growled, but no one answered. Micah looked in that direction too. It wasn't clear if he had seen something or just sensed it. His eyes dimmed slightly before returning to Halbert. "You think no one's ever watching?" he asked, not loud, but loud enough to make Halbert grip the baton a bit tighter. A bicycle passed by, bell jingling, snapping the morning street back into rhythm. No one stopped. People walking by didn't look or pretended not to. But across the street behind the glass, someone someone hadn't looked away. The lens was still open. Every movement, every word, every glance had been captured, unedited, no effects, just raw truth untouched by rank or badge. Halberd straightened up. He didn't know whether to turn around or keep walking. He was used to not being questioned no matter what he did. This kick, he believed, was wrapped safely in the name of maintaining order. Somewhere nearby, a soft click, like a phone changing angles, echoed from inside the shop. Micah still hadn't gotten up. He remained there, head slightly tilted, breathing in short bursts. He wasn't planning to run. He had no reason to beg. He stayed put, right where he'd been struck in broad daylight beside the shredded bread bag, like a period in a sentence just written in violence. And that sentence, in part, had already been recorded by someone. Halberd didn't ask for a name. Didn't ask about health, didn't need a reason. His hand clenched the collar of Micah's shredded coat and lifted the thin body off the ground with just one arm. The sound from his mouth was like a warning, but one repeated so often it had become mechanical. "How many times have I had to clear your kind off this sidewalk?" His voice wasn't loud, but each word hissed through clenched teeth, blending with the stomp of his boots on the pavement like a drumbeat, a warning to those surviving by shrinking into themselves. Micah didn't speak right away. His head tilted slightly back as if his body was too used to being lifted, then thrown. His right arm tensed, gripping Halberd's wrist, but the strength of someone who had lived too long with hunger and darkness couldn't match the muscles of a man who used violence to survive. His lips were cracked, his voice dry and raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken to another human in days. "I used to have a name." That sentence dropped into the air thick as gasoline fumes. It didn't soften Halberd's grip. Instead, he laughed a short sound that scratched through his throat like he'd just heard a badly timed joke. "Your name's on a list for blocking pedestrian flow." He spoke slowly, clearly, like reading an entry off a police database. "My name's on the badge. Want to check?" He leaned in, close, breath heavy with stale coffee and cigarettes aimed straight at the gaunt, tattered face of the homeless man. Micah turned his head out of instinct, not from fear, but from habit, like a survival reflex worn into him over the years. Before letting go, Halberd yanked once more hard enough to fold Micah at the waist. Then, without warning, he shoved him sideways, slamming him into the edge of a concrete bench, sending his body collapsing like a bag of garbage. Micah let out a faint groan. His hand found the crumpled plastic bag with what was left of his bread, the last meal of the day, maybe the only one. He pulled it close, not to eat, not to speak, just moving slowly and carefully, as if protecting something more fragile than the crumbs buried in the dust. Across the street, a black sedan had pulled up along the curb. Inside, the driver's face wasn't visible, just a man's hand raising a phone, tapping the camera app. No sound, no commentary. Everything on that side of the street played out like a silent film, except for the lens still recording and the eyes still watching. On the passenger seat, a newspaper corner fluttered in the breeze, revealing a headline in bold: "Community expands voluntary surveillance network." Halberd straightened, adjusted his belt, scanning the area like an animal marking its territory. He didn't leave right away. He stood there watching Micah lie still. He nudged the bread bag with his boot, not as hard as the first kick, but enough to send crumbs spilling out. He smirked. "People like you just breathe dirtier other people's air." The words fell out casually, like a statement of fact, not an insult, not anger, just a belief buried so deep it had become ordinary. Micah didn't react. He slowly turned his face inward, eyes half closed, lips pressed tight as if locking away every word that might escape. At his age, somewhere between 30 and 40, certain things had already been taken forever, and what remained were faint memories of a life that once had order. His name no longer appeared on rental applications. His photo no longer lived on a health insurance card. But the sentence, "I used to have a name," wasn't just a recollection. It was a final declaration of self in a world that had erased him from the human map. Across the street, the man still held his phone steady in silent mode. No blinking, no zoom, no turning away. Only the look in the rearview mirror, cold, still, and unnervingly clear. His hand kept the phone-level camera aimed directly at Halberd like he was calculating the range of an invisible bullet. Halberd glanced around. He paused for a moment when he noticed a small sign taped to the corner of the grocery store wall across the street. This area under video surveillance. The print was faded, but clear enough to wrinkle his forehead. No one else was there but him and Micah, yet the feeling of being watched clung to the back of his neck. He shot quick looks at windows, car mirrors, and glass surfaces, then lowered his voice. No one cares about this morning. Some nameless guy on the ground. What's there to record? Micah stayed silent. Halberd walked away, but this time not with the same certainty. His stride still belonged to someone used to control, but his face held a flicker of doubt. And in the space behind him, the phone kept filming the wind, kept pushing the newspaper in slow circles around the car's tires, and the man inside hadn't looked away from the screen. Micah, after the footsteps stopped, forced himself upright and leaned against the bench. Each breath pulled pain deep into his stomach, but his eyes opened slowly, then fixed on the shop window across the street. He saw his own reflection, blurred, distorted through the dusty glass. A figure with a bent back and a torn coat, but eyes that had never retreated. And then, in the car, a hand lowered the phone and typed the first words, "Incident. Officer Halberd. Footage attached." Micah was still lying there, eyes half open, breath dragging heavy with each pull stuck to the cold sweating concrete. His head tilted to the side, ears ringing, stomach folded from the kick, as if someone had reached in and twisted his insides tight, strangling every blood vessel trying to reach his heart. Troy Halberd didn't pause to consider whether what he'd just done had gone too far. He stepped around to the back, bent down as if to help, but his hand went straight into the side pocket of Micah's shredded coat. He pulled out the crumpled paper bag, shook it a few times, and laughed. "Where'd you steal this from, Julie's shop or the grocery down the block?" Without waiting for an answer, he squeezed the bag hard, scattering crumbs, then ground it into the pavement like it wasn't food but trash left outside the bin. Micah tried to turn each movement slow, like his joints had been filled with sand. He reached out, trying to pull the bag back, but Halberd's hand was already pressed against his chest. "I asked you, where did you get it?" His voice didn't need to rise. It had weight like a command etched into the air. "Answer me, or I'll kick you again and no one's gonna care." 1 second passed, then 2. Micah didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the crushed bag, silent. Halberd leaned in closer to his face, lowering his voice. "You think staying quiet makes you worth more." Then he stood up, shifting his foot back like he was measuring the next strike. But another sound broke in. A soft voice from across the street, calm but clear, as if someone had stepped out of the shadows and spoken without invitation. "Are you sure?" Halberd snapped around, eyes scanning fast. Just an empty parking lot, the sheen of light bouncing off windshields lined up along the curb. No one. The shops weren't open. No pedestrians. He turned back to Micah, but Micah didn't react either, eyes still half shut. Halberd bit his lower lip. He wasn't scared, but in that moment, something pressed against his chest. Not guilt, but the weight of being seen. He looked up again, and this time he saw it. On a utility pole about 20 feet away, tucked at an angle easy to miss, was a security camera. A small black dome fixed tightly to the metal with a cable looping out the back. A tiny LED blinked once, red to green, signaling it was active. Halberd froze. He hissed quietly through his teeth. That blink didn't make a sound, but in his head it roared a deafening click, like the snap of a trigger inside a space he'd always believed he controlled. Micah still didn't move, but his eyelids seemed to twitch. Halberd squinted, looked up at the camera, then back at Micah. 1 second passed, stretched long like a trial. He let out a dry laugh. "Oh, you think someone's recording this?" He spoke louder now, voice tinged with mockery. "This camera belongs to the neighborhood. I work here. I know exactly how many devices are running. Trust me, not a single one is filming you, and if it is, all it shows is you sprawled out in the street blocking traffic." He turned his head, raised his voice even more, as if making a public announcement. "I didn't assault you. I'm protecting the neighborhood from vagrants taking over the sidewalk. That's all any footage would show. You get that?" He nudged Micah's leg, not to hurt him this time, but as punctuation reinforcing his position. But this time, Micah opened on his eyes. Not fast, not defiant. Just the gaze of someone who knows exactly where pain begins and ends, and when it's time to look back. "I don't need to get it," he whispered. "But are you sure?" The words made Halberd pause. A clear echo of the voice that had spoken from across the street, but now it came from the battered body lying at his feet. The repetition prickled the back of his neck. He turned toward the camera again, eyes widening. Across the street, behind the foggy window of the shop, a figure had just stepped out of view, still holding the phone. The door was slightly ajar. That small sign made no sound, but it was the final piece that told Halberd he was no longer alone on this stage. Everything he had just done, every kick, every word, the crushing of the bread, the hand in the coat pocket might have been captured. And this time, it wasn't just the word of a homeless man against a police officer. Micah, still lying there, gently pulled a scrap of paper from the crushed bag, his mouth lifting into a faint smile that could have been mockery or quiet sorrow, but his eyes were different. No blame, no fear, just a steady gaze through the man standing above him as if everything was moving toward an ending. And maybe this time, Halberd wouldn't be the one who decided how it ends. Troy Halberd stepped back, raised a hand to press the button on the radio, clipped to his shoulder, voice dropping as if facing a threat. "Dispatch, this is Unit 39. Suspect vagrant exhibiting threatening behavior toward law enforcement, obstructing public space, showing signs of resistance, preparing to restrain and detain." He spoke every word cleanly, as if rehearsed, like assigning charges to a black man collapsed on the ground was just part of the daily routine. Not once did he say the man hadn't resisted. Not once did he mention the camera on the utility pole or the silent stare behind the grocery's glass window. It was all condensed into a few lines of false report. On the other end, a brief reply copy. Micah let out a dry cough, the rasp scraping up his throat. Dust from the pavement had settled in his lungs, turning every breath into a tear. He lifted his head slightly, neck bent, voice strained. "I'm just trying to live." It sounded like asking permission, but there was resignation in it. No anger, no defiance, just a fractured admission from a man no longer allowed to sit quietly on land someone had claimed as public. Halberd smirked. "Live, huh?" He nodded slowly, then pulled the handcuffs from his belt, the clink sounding like a theme song of authority. "I see you're living too, but living in the wrong place is still a crime, and today I'm redrawing the map for you." He bent down, grabbed Micah's wrist, and yanked it up. A faint pop cracked from Micah's left shoulder, the sound of a joint dislocated after too long out of use. A groan hissed through Micah's clenched teeth, but never became a word. Halberd's face didn't change. With his other hand, he forced the cuff down, pressing hard. From an upper floor above the grocery store, a thin curtain fluttered. A red glow blinked from a second-story window, not sunlight, but the light from a phone screen. On it, the security camera feed played in clear resolution, the wrinkled coat, Micah's dirt-smeared face, the officer's boot inches from his head, the hand yanking his wrist in pain. In the top corner, faint white letters flashed REC 0607 AM. A finger tapped the virtual keyboard. A drafted message sat ready, missing only one word. The short line, "Now." No recipient name, no signature. The message disappeared the moment it was sent. The figure in the dark didn't wait for a reply, didn't need confirmation. The next blink from the camera was enough, it had already begun. In a separate frame of the scene, Halberd locked the cuffs. The metal clanked hard and cold. "I don't care who you are. I don't need to know who you were. On this street corner, you're trash, and I'm the collector." He said it clearly, each word like a verdict. For him, there was no need to wait for court. Judgment was carried out right here with fists, with kicks, with citations, and the cuffs already loaded in his jacket. From another part of the city, contact points were triggered. The first person to receive the message unlocked their device and checked the timestamp. A second street camera 3 blocks away was also recording from another angle. And a social media account created 6 months earlier, never used before, was now prepared to speak. Micah tilted his head toward the camera on the utility pole, his eyes searching for a faint reflection of himself in the dark lens. In that moment, he knew he wasn't completely abandoned. Someone had seen. And maybe this time the story wouldn't die on the curb like the hundreds before it, stories of people like him. Halberd still believed he was in control. He didn't know that the click from the second floor had set off a chain reaction. He didn't know that within minutes this curb would no longer be a place where he could play God. But in this moment, he stood there exhaling like a general who had just subdued a rebel. "I'm asking you one last time," he growled. "What's your name?" Micah moved his lips, not to give a name, but to repeat what he had already said. "I am just living." And this time the words came out clearer, like an emphasis, a statement forged from silence and bruises. If Halberd heard it, he gave no sign. He stood up, shoved Micah aside, and dragged his body toward the patrol car parked a short distance away. Behind him, the pole's green light kept blinking, and on the second floor, the person eased the curtain back but kept the phone in hand, eyes locked on the slow movement of the 2 figures below. That motion, seemingly ordinary, was being watched by 6 different devices. Each device is held by a different person, and all had received the same message. Now, no one asked why, no one replied, "Who is this?" They just started moving. The story Halberd believed he was controlling had only just begun. On the first screen, a short caption was about to appear this morning in the neighborhood, and beneath it a profile image showed a pair of eyes staring straight ahead. Not Micah's, not Halberd's, but the eyes of the one behind the screen, the one who had never stepped out of the shadows. The pharmacy door swung open, and the chime of the wind bell rang out through the misty morning street. A woman in a dark brown coat stepped outside holding a paper bag with prescription medicine. She had just stepped onto the sidewalk when she caught sight of the scene ahead, a black man in handcuffs, his face swollen with a police officer gripping his collar and growling down at him like he was a notorious criminal. She paused for a few seconds, then reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and opened the camera. She didn't have time to raise it before Halberd spun around, voice sharp and rising. "Put the phone down. Comply now or I'll confiscate it. Obstructing an officer is an arrestable offense, you understand?" The woman froze for a moment but didn't lower the phone. Micah turned his head, eyes swollen but gaze steady. He spoke in a hoarse voice. "Don't film for me. Film for tomorrow." The words carried no special tone, but they made her stop. No one was asking for help. No one was begging for mercy. Just a message, enough reason not to look away. Her hand lifted the phone slowly, not in defiance, not in fear, but as if fulfilling a duty she had just been given. Halberd's eyes widened. He turned and kicked Micah in the stomach again. The blow didn't need momentum, but it was strong enough to make the man gasp, his body curling like a rag wrung too tight. At that moment, a dry beep rang out from the wall clock inside the grocery store across the street. It was the alert every employee knew, a scheduled shift change reminder. But today it marked something else, a moment when the people around began to realize this wasn't just a routine police matter. Right after the kick, Halberd leaned down, growling into Micah's ear. "You know what drives me crazy? It's your kind thinking. Just because you shoot a video, everything changes. Preaching like saints while smelling like garbage. I swear this time nothing's going to save you." He stood, turned toward the woman still holding her phone, and barked again. "I warned you. You're asking for trouble." She stepped back half a pace, said nothing, and didn't stop recording. On her phone screen, the image wasn't just Halberd's face. It also held Micah's swollen eyes fixed straight at the lens. Behind Halberd, the sun had risen a few degrees more, casting a slanted light that stretched the shadows apart, clearly dividing the standing from the fallen. Meanwhile, inside a small newsroom just a few blocks away, a server had received an email with no sender address. The subject line read simply, Rourke, June, Alley 4. It has begun. The morning editor saw the alert and opened it out of curiosity. The inbox held nothing but a 34-second video clip. In the footage, a stationary camera clearly captured the scene. A man, cuffed at the base of a utility pole, kicked while down a woman holding a phone being threatened, and the voice of the victim rising, "Don't film for me. Film for tomorrow." No explanation was needed. The editor hit the download button and placed the phone on the desk. In under 10 seconds, the second screen opened the draft-in window. The story was being framed not as breaking news, but as a blade driven straight into the artery of the community's trust. Officer Rourke, a routine morning, a familiar image and a warning to us. All who is really allowed to exist on this sidewalk at the scene. Halberd was waiting for the backup patrol car to transport Micah. He circled back to the rear of the vehicle, pulled out the report form, and scribbled a few lines. Suspect displayed resistance, posed danger, made threats, and endangered public safety. He wrote without hesitation. He was used to these short, polished lies. In his mind, no one would dare challenge the authority sealed in those official, police-stamped documents. But he didn't know that his radio transmission had just been extracted. He didn't know that the street corner camera had auto-synced footage to the district's cloud storage due to a triggered violence threshold. He also didn't know that the woman still filming across the street was a high school history teacher, one who had led the anti-violence campaign for black students 3 years earlier. She was still filming. Lips pressed, tight eyes steady and cold. She understood exactly what was happening, and this time she knew she would not stand by. Micah closed his eyes, breath ragged. But in his mind, the words still carved themselves deep. I said, "Thank you. You had to be the one to receive it." He thought of the man in some hidden corner, the one he had never met but who had chosen to act. He thought of the red light reflected in the window frame of the word "now" that might have been sent from many places at once. No one needed to know who he was. And at that very moment, even in cuffs, even without a name being asked, even without enough breath to form a full sentence, his eyes remained open. They met the lens of the woman's phone as if to send one last message. Something stays alive every time we're pushed downhill. Less than 2 hours after the first light hit the steeple of the old church at the end of Rourke Street, a 27-second clip surfaced on a subreddit called Justice Lens. The title was clean, no flair, cop kicks man, who's really in the wrong, no location given, no names, no caption needed. Just footage a white police officer baton slung across his belt, kicking a handcuffed black man lying face down on the sidewalk. In the top right corner, the grocery store wall clock froze at 7:01 a.m. On the left, a faint image of a woman standing a few meters away, phone in hand, her body still as stone. In the first 60 minutes, the video gained over 8,000 likes, 2,000 shares, and nearly 1,000 comments. By noon, the hashtag #Micah Rourke was trending across X, Instagram, and independent news aggregators, short, sharp, and cutting. People didn't need to know the victim's full name. Just the scene, the street, and the neighborhood's name were enough to become a symbol. Rourke was no longer a street. It became a signal for what many had always said, but couldn't prove, that police kick people who have nothing left and believe no one is watching. At the Central Precinct, once the video with the local hashtag reached internal channels, the communications team immediately forwarded it to the Internal Affairs Chief. Halberd was temporarily summoned for urgent information review. Walking into the room, his expression hadn't changed, same as every time he'd been reported by civilians with no result. He looked at the screen, voice flat. "This video is edited. It doesn't show the full context." The officer across from him said nothing. A minute later, Halberd insisted again. The subject was resisting threatening nearby civilians and being verbally abusive. I had to act firmly to ensure safety. A compliance officer furrowed his brow and replayed the clip. Micah lay motionless. His hands were cuffed behind his back. No words spoken. No struggle. No visible loss of control in the frame. Only a police officer kicking someone already subdued. No one said a word, but the atmosphere shifted. Internal emails went out with the subject line, "Prepare public statement." On social media, outrage multiplied by the minute. Anonymous accounts dug up Halberd's identity in under 2 hours. An old photo of him with the Blue Lives Matter banner on his Facebook page was a screenshot and spread with the caption, "Looks like blue doesn't protect morals." One user posted a GIF, Halberd mid-kickmouth twisted as if shouting something. The text below read, "That's a pretty aggressive massage." Another account reposted Halberd's denial from the local newspaper, adding only one comment, "Not out of context, out of character." Short clips from the original video looped non-stop, each frame dissected for angles, reactions, and glances. Human rights advocates reshared the footage with cutting captions. Every kick leaves a mark, if not on the body, then on the network. From New York to Seattle, those who had felt their identity trampled began to speak out. A black veteran wrote, "I survived Afghanistan, but I can't live in peace on the street where I was born." A black law student posted, "This was the first thing I learned in constitutional law. No one is above it." So, which article covers that kick? Major media outlets got involved. CNN ran with a 27-second video from an unnamed street corner could shake a state. The Washington Post opened a debate, is it time to change how police abuse is handled? On local evening news, the anchor repeated Micah's words, "Don't film for me, film for tomorrow." That line was now a call to action for everyone. By midnight, when the Guardian article linked the original subreddit post, the view count had crossed 2 million. Below it, comments kept flooding in. One read, "If this is the final kick, make sure it starts a real investigation." Another simply wrote, "Rourke has been lit. Do we have the courage to keep it burning?" In an old third-floor apartment on the west side of the city, a man removed the battery from his phone, set it on the table, and opened his laptop. In his inbox, multiple copies of the original video were stored. He checked the IP cloaking system again, enabled anonymity, and sent a new version to the investigative journalist who had broken last year's prison abuse case. The subject line read, "Rourke wasn't the first kick, but let's make it the last." Incidents like this may have happened and been seen many times before, but this time it could be the story that starts a new era, because now it is beginning to surface in the light. 9:30 a.m. As the wave of outrage continued sweeping across every social platform, a new account appeared on a subreddit dedicated to police oversight, username Obsidian197. No profile picture, no bio, just a single post quietly titled 3 Angles, 1 Truth. Inside was a folder containing 3 separate video clips. No intro, no guiding commentary. Each file labeled only by time Rourke, 6:59 Rourke, 7:02 Rourke, 7:04. The first clip was from a rooftop angle. The camera sat near a vent pipe, its metal edge catching the early light. From above, the whole scene was visible. The lamppost where Micah was kicked stood to the right. The pharmacy car was centered. Halberd's figure leaned forward, baton in hand. Viewers could see him circle the man on the ground, press his foot into his side, then bend down to search his jacket. There was no sign of fear, no hint of being attacked, just a calculated cruelty like dealing with an animal. The second video was filmed from across the street between a row of public benches. A level shot clearly showing Halberd's face. The woman, raising her phone, briefly appeared, pulling it back just as Halberd shouted. 1 second later, he turned, stomped down, and leaned close to Micah, teeth clenched. "I don't care who you are. People like you just breathe dirt other people's air." The words came through clearly, mixed with the wind skimming the empty pavement. The final clip came from the dash cam of bus number 47, paused at the intersection 2 blocks away. Though the video was grainy, the audio was clearer than expected. In the 18-second clip, Halberd could be heard speaking to a newly arrived security officer. "I do this every week. These vagrants know me. They see me, they run. But this one's stubborn. He needed to remember it. There was no hesitation in his voice. It wasn't a threat, it was routine. All 3 clips spread rapidly through private groups and community oversight forums. Users began piecing together the details, Halberd's movements, the positions of witnesses, even reconstructing a full scene diagram with camera points. But what stirred the community most wasn't the video or the audio. It was the lone note attached below the post. User Obsidian197 wrote just one sentence. This video isn't about one man. It's about the entire system. No declarations, no threats. But the impact was deep and undeniable. Posts tagged Rourke Systemic began to appear. People who had been treated similarly reposted old photos and videos, some captioned, "Last week it was me," but no one recorded it. A sociology professor from the state university commented, "When a behavior repeats enough times without consequence, it's no longer personal conduct. It becomes policy." At the police department's media office, staff scrambled to review Halberd's conduct file. More than 80 encounters with unhoused citizens in 6 months, 13 assault complaints, 3 internal recommendations for warnings, all closed due to lack of visual evidence. A female investigator sighed. "Now we've got 3 angles. The question isn't did it happen, but why it took so long for anyone to see it." A superior frowned. "It's not that no one saw it, it's that no one was made to look." As the wave of shares continued to grow, WBN's Morning News aired a special segment. Officer Halberd is now under internal review while the identity of the assaulted man, called Micah Rourke by internet users, has yet to be officially confirmed. The anchor clarified. According to the city medical center, the man was admitted to the ER yesterday morning but later left the hospital. His current whereabouts are unknown. News of Micah vanishing from the hospital spread like a low fog. Some believed he feared retaliation, and others worried he had been detained off the record. One commenter wrote, "Can't let someone who dared to endure and then dared to stay silent disappear like a shadow." Another asked, "Is Micah even his real name, or just a symbol for everyone who ever got kicked when no one was recording?" The question spread not to pinpoint a name, but to remind everyone that the victim's name is not what makes the violence forgivable. A group of law students proposed forming an independent video watchdog, collecting and analyzing footage from public cameras, dash cams, and personal phones. They named the project Blind Spot. Their slogan, "If justice is blind, give it more eyes." In their open letter to state officials, they wrote, "Not for one person, but for those erased from the lens and from public memory." Across the city, in an abandoned church, a figure sat hunched by a broken window. Light slipped through rusted bars, falling across a folded newspaper. On the front page, Halberd's face was half covered by a shadow cast from the headline, "Officer with routine. Use of force." Video exposes hidden pattern. A thin hand held the paper. The other clutched a piece of bread still marked with dried mud. The man looked out at an empty courtyard where 2 children were drawing with white chalk on the cement and let out a quiet breath. No one called his name, but he was still there, and someone was still watching every step he took. That morning, the front pages of dozens of major newspapers changed in unison. A still from the video showed Halberd, mid-kick hand, gripping handcuffs, face contorted with anger. Next to bold headlines, "Abuse of power in public, where are the limits of the badge?" Some outlets used the rooftop camera angle, framing Micah curled on the curb, Halberd's shadow cast over his face. National media picked up the story. Morning shows on WBN, NBC, and the New York Sentinel all opened with the same report. A police officer crossed a line, but Where's that line and who gets to draw it? Legal experts appeared on air. Hosts referenced the case, the Rourke incident, a homeless man assaulted, then disappeared with his name and background still unknown. What we do know is the action, and what we must question is the system. A wave of attorneys weighed in on legal standards, ethics, and the boundaries of authority. One guest emphasized, when someone in uniform feels entitled to humiliate another person on camera, that's not just individual misconduct, it's silent endorsement by the entire structure. At the Rourke Police Department, internal pressure peaked. The disciplinary board called an emergency meeting. Half the leadership demanded Halbert's immediate suspension for impartial investigation. The other half argued a video alone wasn't conclusive and more witness confirmation was needed. The head of HR reminded them, "We don't manage media, we manage behavior. But if we don't act, the media will manage the credibility of this entire force." Meanwhile, a flood of emails, petitions, and open letters poured into the Inspector General's office. Many called for Halbert's disciplinary records to be made public. An investigative journalist group began digging into his background and uncovered unusual inconsistencies. As for Micah, a leaked internal police email revealed that man previously served in the military. There's an ID-coded file, but no one knows the full detail. Seems tied to an overseas special ops mission, partially classified. Discussions exploded. What began as a case of public assault shifted to a new question. Who is Micah Rourke? Former military personnel spoke up in his defense. One wrote, "The way he lay there, still silent but looking straight ahead, that's not weakness. That's someone who's been tortured before. Who knows? Silence is a survival tactic." Another veteran commented under the video, "We were trained never to run. Even without the uniform, that habit doesn't leave you." News that Micah may have served in the armed forces changed the tone of public discourse. Hashtags like #JusticeFor Micah, #Veteran Rights, and #Rourke Protocol began trending. People no longer just saw a man being beaten. They saw betrayal. A soldier who once served now trampled on the very ground he had once sworn to protect. At the state communications office, a political advisor warned the governor, "If this escalates, you'll have to speak. Even if it's a low-ranking officer, your response will represent the system's stand." Hours later, an official statement was released. "We are calling for a full review by investigative agencies. No one civilian or law enforcement is allowed to cross the line of basic moral conduct." Meanwhile, social media exploded with theories about Micah. Some claimed he had appeared in a military training video from North Carolina. Others compared his face to a blurry clip from a 2009 Pentagon release. A grainy photo circulated showing a man in uniform crouched beside a Humvee, holding a map-head-bowed posture unmistakably like Micah's. One comment read, "If that's him, then his silence isn't weakness. It's knowing exactly how quickly a voice like his gets smothered." At the same time, new questions emerged. Why did Halbert target Micah specifically? Had they met before? Was this a deliberate, racially motivated act? People began compiling Halbert's past incidents, mapping a pattern of repeated aggression toward unhoused black men in the area. The Rourke Tribune reported, "In 6 months, at least 13 similar cases occurred, no video. Now there is. And now it's time to go back." In a popular podcast studio, a special episode aired titled "His Name is Micah, or It Could Be Any of Us." The host shared, "When we ask, who is Micah Rourke? Maybe we're asking the wrong question. The real one is, what did we do that made him disappear?" In a dimly lit briefing room at the police department, Halbert sat before the disciplinary board, no longer wearing the defiant look he once had. He insisted I was set up. Someone's trying to frame me. An investigator asked, "Do you know where he served?" Halberd replied. "I don't care who he is. To me, he's trash." The investigator said nothing, only placed a rooftop still in front of him. "The problem is, this time the whole world is watching you." And beyond that wall, thousands of eyes really were watching. Not just from cameras, but from people who'd been ignored. From those who'd been kicked down both literally and metaphorically without anyone speaking up. This time, even in Micah's silence, the world was speaking for him. Micah's silence became the center of the most heated debates as media outlets turned en masse to trace his military background. While the police department scrambled to manage public backlash, a group of veterans in Texas released a video statement, "We know Micah. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader on missions that never made it into reports." A man named Franklin Hayes, who served in the same unit, told CNN via Zoom, "In tactical reconnaissance circles, if you've ever heard the code name Rourke Red, then you've heard of him. No one survives that many missions without carrying the marks. He doesn't speak much because he's done too much." That quote spread across social media, becoming a slogan printed under Micah's portrait. He didn't speak. He survived. Meanwhile, a leaked Department of Defense memo confirmed that Micah had been part of a 2012 Special Operations campaign listed as one of the first responders in a Middle East deployment. Though most of the file was redacted, one unsealed fragment revealed he had been assigned to Shadow Recoil, a unit that appears only in classified documents. Notably, after his final mission, Micah's name vanished from all reports post-2014. No discharge record, no repatriation, no medical file. A 10-year blank space, and that void sparked a wave of questions. How does someone like him end up anonymous on a street corner holding a bag of bread like none of it ever happened? A former military commander named Tulliver posted on a veterans forum, "Files like Rourke's aren't erased because they don't matter. They're sealed because they've seen what isn't meant to be retold. And because of that, they're often left outside the system." The post was shared over 18,000 times in just a few hours, followed by comments from former service members who claimed they'd seen Rourke at a psychological recovery camp after the last operation, eyes hollow but never broken. One wrote, "We lost friends, he lost language." These accounts didn't just evoke sympathy, they reignited public anger. How could someone like him be left collapsed on a curb because of a single cop's kick? And if he stood for what America once sent to the front lines, then that kick wasn't just aimed at him, it hit everything people once believed honor meant. On several independent investigative forums, users began retracing past incidents linked to Halberd, especially assaults on unhoused individuals with prior military service. A journalist specializing in veterans policy wrote, "How many people like Micah have been erased, and how much violence has been legitimized simply because the victim no longer had the records to fight back?" These questions pushed local authorities to hold an emergency meeting with the Department of Veterans Affairs, ordering a cross-check of support databases and a review of cases overlooked during reintegration. A spokesperson told the press, "If he once belonged to us, then we must also answer why he was allowed to vanish." That night's news opened with the anchor's line, "When the man carrying a passport in this country refuses to acknowledge and gets kicked down in the street, it's no longer just about one officer. It's about America." Below the video, one viewer commented, "Now I understand why he didn't react. He survived in places without cameras, and he knew this time the whole world was watching." As more records surfaced, one photo went viral. Micah sitting silently, arms around a bag of bread under the dim glow of an old street lamp, eyes steady, not sad, not afraid, just waiting. And this time, people began to listen. Halberd stood in front of a police headquarters, pale as he accepted a summons from a federal courier. The bold text on the header left no room for excuses. Internal hearing notice, urgency level high. Outside, the press was already waiting, microphones and lenses crowding him like a siege line. He walked without looking at anyone, but the cameras caught the subtle tremble in the hand holding the paper, not from the wind. In the press conference that followed, the Assistant Inspector General stated, "The matter involving Officer Troy Halbert is now under formal civil investigation in conjunction with a probe into potential systemic abuse of authority." The language was dry procedural, but behind the bureaucracy, a wave of public outcry had reached those once silent. A coalition of civil rights lawyers held a separate assembly in front of City Hall, where attorney Rachel Aiken, known for prosecuting police abuse cases, declared firmly, "No one has the right to kick the face of a man who once stood at this nation's borders, whether he lies on a curb or stands on a podium of honor." That sentence echoed through evening broadcasts, quoted widely as a direct challenge to the power structure now visibly cracking. Meanwhile, social media circulated a side-by-side image of Halbert receiving his summons, and Micah's military file photo, one a police officer with a stunned expression, the other a soldier in combat gear, eyes fixed on a distant horizon beyond any known border. A pinned comment on a legal forum read, "One protects power with a badge. One protects the nation with his life. Now, tell me who really needs protecting." These visuals, along with the leaked clip of Halbert admitting "I do this every week," formed a complete picture, not of an isolated mistake, but of a deliberate, structured pattern of violence. Inside the police department, tension reached a breaking point. A group of younger officers submitted transfer requests, fearing they'd be implicated if past cases were reopened. One of them wrote anonymously on a private forum, "We saw Halbert do it." But everyone stayed quiet. Now, no one's safe. The division pushed leadership to issue an internal memo instructing all personnel to cooperate with the investigation and refrain from speaking to the media. But that enforced silence only fueled public outrage. Survivors of past abuse began filing joint complaints, revisiting cases previously dismissed for lack of evidence. Now they had video, testimony, and a symbol to rally around Micah Rourke, the man beaten for sitting still who made the entire system shift. At a city council session, one council member stated, "If one kick makes society look at itself, then that kick didn't come from one man. It came from a system that believes no one stands up for those on the ground." The quote was broadcast across news outlets, placed beside images of Micah saying nothing, not resisting, but whose silence had become the loudest accusation. Halbert, once stepping onto curbs with authority, now sat under inquiry. No badge, no weapon, just a summons and the scrutiny of a watching public. And while he bowed his head to sign somewhere else, a group of veterans lit candles before a faded 2012 photo of Rourke. No speeches, no chants, just a reminder that some who fall to the curb still stand taller than what we call the law. Micah was found in a wooden shack deep in the forest beneath rustling branches that covered a faded tarp roof and an old backpack worn at the edges, nearly blending into the wilderness. The one who found him was a freelance journalist named Lynn, who tracked his location by analyzing video timestamps and phone signal trails. When Lynn stepped into the shack, he was met by the vacant gaze of someone who no longer wished to speak to the world. Not angry, not bitter, just the stillness of someone who had seen too much and had nothing left to say. On the floor was a small notebook filled with Times weather logs, patrol routes, and coded military symbols, traces of a man who maintained discipline as a survival instinct even after being cast out of every system that once protected him. News of Micah's discovery spread quickly, and within 48 hours he appeared at a public hearing where the city council, police department, prosecutors, and press filled the chamber. He didn't wear a uniform nor a tailored suit, just a light gray shirt, faded, khaki pants, and hiking boots still dusted with dirt. But when he entered the room, fell silent. It wasn't the shock that quieted the room, but the fact that no one could meet his eyes for more than a few seconds. There was something in his gaze that disoriented the room, a stillness not easily analyzed, not easily named, but deeply felt, as if everyone there was facing something more binary grindin' than law memory. The moderator asked, "Are you prepared to recount the events of the morning of June 16th?" Micah didn't answer right away. He stared toward the back of the room at an empty chair. Then he spoke, his voice low, but no microphone needed adjusting. I was sitting there, on the curb between two streetlights. I didn't say anything, didn't beg. They still came. No one interrupted. No one rushed him. He recounted every detail as if redrawing a map of memory, from the sound of boots hitting the pavement to the cold stab in his ribs after the second kick. He didn't describe pain or humiliation. He recorded it like a soldier describing a front line, each act, each reaction, each sound pressed into silence. When asked why he didn't fight back, Micah replied, "Because at that moment I had nothing left to protect, and I wanted to see if a man sitting still is still considered a man." It wasn't meant to provoke, but the prosecutor gently closed their folder. In that instant, no one dared to speak another word. A veteran seated in the back wiped his eyes. Online, the audio clip circulated with a single caption, "Silent, like a barracks waiting for the casualty list." The hearing ended without applause, and no one immediately left their seat. People stayed as if still caught under a spotlight. When Micah exited the chamber, the back door closed, but the silence lingered. Somewhere out on the street behind a phone screen, people began to understand this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about who had been silent for too long. And maybe the last one who endured was the only one able to make society truly listen. Halberd stood there a few feet away from the witness he had once called garbage on a morning he thought no one was watching. But now everyone was watching. News cameras, prosecution files, and the eyes of those who no longer trusted the system Halberd once represented. His uniform remained pressed, his hair neatly combed, but nothing could hide the tremble in the corners of his eyes and the bend of his wrist in the heel, shifting softly like it didn't belong there. Standing before the man he had taken down, Halberd slowly bowed his head. No apology was spoken, because words now would only cheapen the truth, but that gesture, late as it was, spoke louder than any defense. Micah's expression didn't change, and he didn't step back. He looked at Halberd not with contempt, not with hatred, but with the gaze of someone who had seen far worse, a gaze that had learned to name humiliation without raising its voice. "I don't need you to kneel," he said, his voice steady, neither shaken nor cold. "I need you to understand that kick came from an entire generation that never got an apology." No one in the chamber spoke, but every breath slowed. The court stenographer couldn't keep typing, her hands were trembling. An old man folded his hands in prayer, while the woman beside him covered her face with a handkerchief. That sentence. It wasn't a verdict, not a retaliation. It was a quiet appeal, submitted to the city's own history. Micah asked for nothing for himself. What he did was force society to confront a debt it had ignored for too long. The kick didn't break his bones, but it exposed how people were ranked in silence. Black, homeless, unnamed, unheard, and when they reacted, labeled aggressive. He didn't cite his military record, didn't mention valor, and didn't need anyone to do it for him. Because if people only held back because he once served, then they were ready to keep stomping on those without a resume to shield their name. Halberd looked down, said nothing. No one defended him. The police department, which once denied the video, once excused his actions, now chose silence. Tweets that once backed him were deleted, and articles that once buried the truth turned into internal investigations. But the clearest truth was this: today, Halberd realized he no longer represented justice. He was only a fragment of a system that let brutality wear a badge. And when the badge was gone and the power to arrest no longer, his bowing before the man he once beat was the last act left to salvage a shred of his humanity. Micah left the courtroom as the sunlight faded. He didn't hurry, didn't linger. In his hand was no medal, no statement, just the old notebook he had kept from his days hiding in the woods, filled with codes, with symbols. And now a new line, spoken, heard. He walked into the crowd of reporters who didn't shove, who simply stood still, as if they understood today wasn't for comments, but for witnessing something long overdue. A young woman held up a handwritten sign sign. You weren't silent. We won't look away again. And maybe when a society pauses to listen to someone who was once kicked in the chest without anyone asking his name, that's the first real sign that justice, though late, can still find its way toward what's right. Micah didn't bow his head, didn't wave. He simply looked back at the courtroom one last time, then walked away, leaving behind no statement but imprinting something lasting on the collective conscience that courage doesn't need banners, only the refusal to abandon yourself even when an entire city tries to erase your name. In the second hearing, the courtroom no longer carried the stiff tension of the first, but something deeper, quieter, heavier. The next witness was retired Colonel Clarence Dorn, a silver-haired veteran with broad shoulders, a voice graveled by cigarettes but razor-sharp. He stepped up to the stand, adjusted the microphone, scanned the room, and nodded to the judge. "I was the commanding officer of the Northern Mosul Combat Unit in 2009, he said, "and the man you're calling homeless saved my entire platoon from an ambush at 3 in the morning. If it weren't for him, my name would be on a headstone." The room fell silent, not because it was a story of heroism, but because that validation came from someone who had stood on both battlefields, the literal one and the legal one. A high-ranking officer stood in a court of law to defend the honor of a man who had once been kicked on a sidewalk. Colonel Dorn didn't embellish. He recounted every step, every timestamp from Micah breaking formation to double back for 3 pinned scouts to the way he led them out without firing a shot. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened because they knew survival depended on it. He finished with a steady voice. "He's the kind of man you want with you when you're surrounded, and the kind of man society should stand with." After his testimony, a video was played before the entire court. The screen showed a grueling training session in rocky terrain under harsh sunlight and wind kicking up dust. In the frame, Micah wore field fatigues, demonstrating how to construct a shelter from minimal materials. He didn't shout or command. Every instruction came through crisp movements, a cold stare, and a low voice as if speaking to each soldier one by one. One scene showed him walking to a rookie who had slipped on the climbing rope, gently releasing the safety clip and saying, "Your left leg's shaking, not because of the height, but because you don't trust the rope." The courtroom was still not from sentimentality, but from the realization that the man once tagged as a homeless statistic had once taught others how to trust the fragile line between survival and collapse. The defense attorney stood eyes sharp and asked bluntly, "As a commander, do you believe someone like Micah could be a threat to the public?" The colonel didn't hesitate. "The only threat is when society stops recognizing who's worth protecting." The answer wasn't loud, but it landed in the dead center of a legal system, scrambling to prove the opposite. When the court recessed, reporters flooded the hallway with a single headline, "Old Soldier, New Honor." A major network replayed the training video for 2 straight hours under the simple title, "Who's Holding the Line for Whom?" That question needed no immediate answer. But one thing was clear from that day on: no one could reduce Micah to a throwaway label. He was someone who had once stood at the edge of life and death, and now was forcing an entire city to reckon with the thin line between justice and forgetting. The judge ordered the video paused. The courtroom lights dimmed again, but no one relaxed. All eyes turned to Micah. The man once knocked to the pavement, now standing upright in the middle of the courtroom, his expression unreadably calm. A gray-haired council member with thin glasses held a pen to his notepad but didn't write. He asked, voice clear and deliberate, "Why didn't you react when you were assaulted? With your military background, you could have easily subdued that officer." Micah didn't rush to answer. He exhaled softly, glancing at Halbert across the room, who sat with his gaze lowered, unable to meet his eyes. "I knew I was on a different battlefield," Micah said simply, as if that was all that needed to be said. But in that simplicity, the room sank into a heavy silence. No one reached for a water glass. No one checked a phone. No one shifted in their seat. Because that answer wasn't about endurance, it was about choice. Micah didn't bow out of helplessness, nor did he stay still out of fear. He knew if he had fought back, he'd be another black man attacking a cop. But by staying still, he became a living witness to a truth no system could distort. The judge looked down at the thick case file, flipped through pages marked with old ink stamps, then nodded gently. She said nothing more. But beneath the bench, her hand gripped the gavel tighter. Spectators slowly turned to look at Halberd, the man who once strutted down a street flashing his badge, now sitting frozen, sweat dampening the back of his wrinkled collar. He was no longer in control, and as he lowered his head, what filled his eyes wasn't remorse or fear, but a blankness hard to name, the emptiness of someone who once believed he was the law, now being judged by it. The human rights attorney standing beside Micah spoke softly. "You've reclaimed the right to tell your story in your own voice, and I believe the entire council heard it today." Micah said nothing, but his gaze held steady, fixed forward, neither seeking approval nor dodging it. A journalist in the back row quietly opened a laptop and typed a new headline. The man who stayed silent on the street made the whole system go quiet. Someone nearby whispered, "The way he didn't fight back was the strongest fight of all." Because Micah's silence, standing in the world that had once drowned him in prejudice, was an act of intention, a resistance without weapons, without slogans, only a gaze that wouldn't look away. And sometimes in rooms used to shouting matches, the weight of stillness is the loudest bell. It makes the loud lower their voices and the high look others in the eye. In that moment, Micah wasn't just answering the council. He was answering for an entire generation mislabeled, erased, and denied the right to a future. And his silence was the one voice that made every table of judgment shift. As the court clerk read the summary aloud, the air in the courtroom turned cold, as if someone had flung open a door to a chamber full of truths people had long tried to keep sealed. In 8 years of service, he said, Officer Troy Halberd had 34 encounters with homeless individuals. Of those, 29 had no body camera footage. The final sentence was delivered in an even tone, not accusatory, but each word struck the seats of those listening like hammer blows. Halberd clenched his fists, but no one stepped up to explain for him. His defense attorney glanced at the data sheet but said nothing. A few council members tilted their heads, scribbling notes. The media already had their headlines forming. Micah, meanwhile, remained still, unmoved, unsurprised. He didn't look at Halberd but turned toward the council, his voice low and steady. Who monitored these cases? No one answered right away. No one dared. Because the question wasn't about numbers, it was about responsibility, about forcing the system to face the gap it had built and allowed to grow. In the cases with no footage, who wrote the reports? He asked again, his eyes cutting through the wooden paneling. Who signed off on statements with no witnesses, no objections? These weren't rhetorical questions. They were an inquest. A lawyer from the back rows stood and spoke softly. We tried requesting files from the central system, but some were lost or not properly saved. Another voice followed, citing technical errors frequently used in internal records. Micah nodded, not smiling, but his eyes marked another rupture in the wall called justice. A woman on the council pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and asked slowly, Mr. Rourke, what do you think is the greatest risk in cases without footage? Micah replied instantly, without pause. It's not that someone might get beaten. It's that an entire community is forced to believe that person deserved it. Silence returned, heavier than breath. Outside in the hall, a group of protesters quietly held signs, "Justice is accountability." Micah's questions had already left the courtroom. They were echoing in online forums, city council chambers, and human rights boardrooms. No one was asking who Halberd was anymore. They were asking, how many Halberds haven't we met? How many cameras have gone dark? How many people have knelt on sidewalks unseen? A young reporter typed the opening line of a new article. When the law law protects only one side, the other doesn't need to riot, they just need to ask the right question. And today in court, Micah did exactly that. Not with shouting, not with demands for compensation, but by tearing open the gray area where the law had once shielded couldn't be verified. He didn't ask to restore fairness for himself, he asked to make the system answer for itself. And from that moment, the law was no longer a wall between justice and the victim. It became a mirror forced to face its own reflection. The court summoned a representative from the police department that same afternoon as sunlight slanted across the stone steps and illuminated the silent crowd gathering outside the hearing hall. The spokesperson, a middle-aged man in a dark shirt, stepped onto the witness stand with heavy eyes from sleepless nights. He spoke in a steady tone, but a single sentence was enough to hush the entire room. "We acknowledge procedural failures in data storage." The words carried no apology, but they marked the first official admission that the once trusted system had allowed inexcusable gaps to form. Some council members exchanged glances and others scribbled notes. Halbert's defense lawyer tried to mask a flicker of unease. Micah didn't take his eyes off the spokesman, not because of what he said, but because of the long void behind those lost files. On the screen, to the side of the courtroom, a visual breakdown appeared, data entries marked incomplete logs, missing timestamps, and memory cards labeled sync error that were never recovered. A tech department representative was brought in to confirm backup procedures and revealed that in at least 6 incidents, Halbert's body camera had shut off during encounters with homeless individuals. No one in the department had reported this. No one had asked why. It was labeled a technical issue, a catch-all phrase that had quietly excused years of collective silence. Outside the courtroom, the crowd began raising signs. On cardboard panels, bold black letters read, "Being poor is not a crime." The message wasn't aimed at Halbert, but at the system that allowed power to select its victims based on status, skin color, posture, and where someone happened to sleep at night. Other signs followed, "Badge isn't a license to harm." Where was oversight if not now, when police officers stood nearby maintaining distance but not intervening? Some read the signs quietly, nodding faintly. Inside, Micah remained standing, eyes fixed on the screen. He didn't need to say anything more. The story was no longer just about an officer attacking a man sleeping on the curb. It was about a long sequence of small deviations normalized by procedure and protected by indifference. No one breaks the law all at once, a behavioral analyst testified. It starts with skipping a video review. Then a report is missing a line. Then a kick no one records, until hurting someone becomes an accepted part of the job. Micah turned slightly toward the counsel. His gaze was neither harsh nor accusing, but there was something in it, expectation. Not for himself, but for an answer society had owed people like him for far too long. After a short discussion, the counsel made its ruling the case would proceed to supervisory accountability. Department heads responsible for data oversight would be summoned. At that very moment, an older citizen walked in and quietly placed on the evidence table a copy of the missing bus dash cam footage, the one the police department had claimed was unrecoverable. It had never been lost. No one inside the system had looked deep enough to find it. The court recessed for an hour. As people stepped outside, no one spoke loudly. On the sidewalk, those once labeled as obstructions to public order now sat together in silence, but there was light in their wrinkled eyes. A young woman whispered to her law student son, "Remember today." This is when a system began to lose its ability to deny. Micah remained seated, looking up at a sky slowly shifting colors. In that silence, for the first time, he was no longer a target of power. He was the reason it had to bow. And with every line of exposed data, every recorded admission, the law was no longer a place to hide, but a place that must now answer. When the presiding judge announced the next witness as the owner of the account, Obsidian 97, the courtroom shifted subtly. A side door opened, and a young man with short black hair, a steady gait despite visible tension on his face, entered carrying a backpack slung over one shoulder and a thick bundle of documents held tightly in his hand. He took the witness seat, lifted his head, and faced the room that for months had only known him through anonymous clips posted at a time when the public needed a jolt to wake up. The attorney stood, asked his name, profession, and confirmed his link to the footage showing Micah being assaulted. He nodded, voice not loud but clear. "My name is Ruben Torres, senior law student, Franklin University. And yes, I'm the person behind that account." Some in the room murmured, others frowned, but Ruben's gaze never wavered. He described how that day he was sitting in a cafe across the street waiting for a class on legal ethics. When he heard shouting from across the street, he raised his phone out of reflex, not to post online, but because his mother had taught him if you can't help, at least preserve the proof. He didn't know who the man was, nor the officer, but within 10 seconds he realized he was witnessing something beyond protocol. "I'm not a hero," Ruben said. "I just knew that if I saw it and didn't keep it someday, I'd forget what was right and what was wrong." The police department's lawyer cut in, asking why Ruben hadn't submitted the video to authorities immediately. He answered without hesitation, "Because I once applied for an internship at this department. They didn't reject me for my skills, but said I questioned too much." That response prompted quiet, knowing glances between some of the council members. "I didn't believe I'd be protected if I handed it over to them, so I waited," Ruben continued. "And I went public when it was clear no one could deny the truth anymore." Micah sat in the back row, not lowering his head, not showing any expression. But when Ruben finished his testimony, their eyes met, not in thanks, but in recognition that every act of preserving truth, no matter how small, can become an irreversible turning point. The council requested that Ruben submit the original footage and all timestamp information for the official record. He agreed without hesitation, handing the stack of documents to the court clerk. Written across the top in black ink, "This video is not meant to accuse one man. It exists to remind us of the limits of power and why the law must always have someone to guard it." Outside of the courthouse, news outlets broke the story simultaneously. The anonymous witness had come forward. Some called him the brave young man, others saw it simply as a basic act of moral responsibility. But Ruben, when asked after the hearing, said only one thing: "I didn't study law to speak well in court, but to know that staying silent at the wrong time is also a crime." That sentence, widely shared, would later become the opening line of professional ethics courses in many law schools. Inside the courtroom, the hearing wasn't over, but one truth had become clear: Halberd's kick hadn't just struck the body of a former soldier, it had jolted awake an entire generation of witnesses and resistors, and Ruben, who had never even met Micah, became part of that resistance, not through power, but through memory, and the courage to preserve it against the weight of forgetting. Halberd stood, voice rushed but offbeat. "That video doesn't clearly show my face. You can't prove the person in it is me." His words rang out in a room where everyone had watched the clip at least 10 times. He wiped his face, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt, eyes darting as if searching for somewhere to hide from the truth. His defense attorney launched into a flurry of counter-arguments: no direct facial ID, poor camera angle, and lack of audio confirmation. But then the court's tech officer stepped forward quietly, presenting GPS logs from the radio unit Halberd had worn that day. Red dots appeared on the screen minute by minute, second by second. The coordinates matched the camera angle, the movement path, and the exact moment Micah hit the pavement. And they matched the voice in the third video, saying, "I do this every week." No one in the room said anything, not even Halberd. He stood there, fists clenched, but his shoulders had dropped. At that point, no one cared what else he had to say. The objective data had spoken. The presiding judge called a 15-minute recess, then returned with a preliminary ruling. Based on verified evidence, Officer Troy Halberd's actions cannot be considered isolated. They constitute a pattern of systemic abuse of authority repeated and directed toward a vulnerable group within society. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the audience placed a hand on her chest, exhaling like a stone had just been lifted. A young man tightened his grip on his wife's hand. Outside, journalists began typing new headlines, not questions like, "What happened?" but declarations like, "The truth is now exposed." But while the room centered its anger on Halberd, Micah's gaze remained steady, not toward the man who struck him, but toward the last empty row where an old backpack sat untouched, where the forgotten used to sit, watch, and vanish. Micah didn't clap. He didn't smile. He simply nodded when he heard the phrase systemic abuse of authority, because to him that was never a revelation. It was just the moment society finally started calling old truths by their real names. He knew that convicting one man wouldn't heal wounds built up over generations, but forcing a system to name its own behavior, that was the first necessary step toward change. And in that moment, he understood that the confrontation between a former soldier and a police officer was no longer just between them. It had become the story of a nation who is protected by the law, who gets crushed in the name of enforcing it, who gets heard, and who has to stand up after being knocked down to make this entire room fall silent. The answer today had started to take shape, but the fight to keep it from being forgotten was just beginning, and Micah remained not to witness the ending, but to make sure no one was allowed to look away ever again. On social media, especially Twitter, the hashtag #RourkeJustice spread at an unprecedented rate. Every passing second brought hundreds of shares, comments, and responses from across continents. The number surpassed 4 million mentions within just 48 hours, turning Micah Rourke's name into a global symbol. From social justice activists in New York to law students in Nigeria, from veterans in Texas to human rights groups in Sweden, all focused on the same question. Why does someone who once defended a nation have to prove he deserves to live safely within its borders? Major networks like CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera ran extensive coverage, opened up panel discussions, and revisited the case from multiple angles, tracing the long history of similar incidents once hidden or ignored. But this time, something had shifted. Those who once stayed silent began to speak. Those who once turned away came back and stood with the truth. On a street in New Orleans, a mural was painted overnight by a group of local artists. No one claimed authorship, but everyone knew why it had to appear. Against the weathered brick of an abandoned building, Micah's face stared straight ahead, without anger, without fear. Beneath it, scrawled in white paint by hand, "I knelt not to beg, but to breathe." The words needed no footnote. They rang out like an indictment against a system where a human breath had become something to negotiate for. That wall became a gathering point within hours, a place where people placed their hands on fresh paint, lit candles, and whispered truths they'd never dared to say aloud. They didn't cry just for Micah. They cried because too many Micahs had existed unnamed, unmemorialized. At a high school in Atlanta, a history teacher replaced the lesson on the Industrial Revolution with a discussion titled, "The Right to Exist in a System That Doesn't Presume You're the Enemy." Students recreated symbols from Micah's case, wrote letters to Congress, and launched a forum to keep questioning injustices they'd previously thought were just adult issues. In San Francisco, a group of young lawyers launched a TikTok channel to explain legal terms related to the case, making phrases like qualified immunity and use of force policy trending topics on a platform built for entertainment. In London, a research institute published a comparative report on racial bias in law enforcement globally, using Micah's case as its focal point. And on late-night talk shows, hosts hosts stopped joking. They asked pointedly if silence was once complicity. How long must we keep speaking this time? Micah never appeared before the media cameras. He maintained the same posture he held in court, never stepping into the spotlight, only allowing the light to fall where it belonged. But that didn't stop people from naming him among those who ignite change. New songs were written, poems recited at community gatherings, banners raised outside city halls across the country. Reading "Being Poor" is not a crime. Being silent is worse. The matter had moved far beyond a single case of misconduct. It became a measure of a society's response. And amid all the noise, what people remembered most wasn't a shout, but the quiet words of a man once to the ground. "I don't need you to kneel. I need you to understand that kick came from an entire generation that's never been apologized to." That line turned a testimony into a slogan, a witness into a collective memory, and a case into a national keyword. The Southern Division of Human Rights Watch formally submitted a letter requesting the city government to review all records of homeless-related enforcement actions over the past 10 years. In the attached 48-page preliminary report, they cited over 200 individuals who had been detained, searched, or removed from public spaces without clear evidence of any legal violation, many of whom had no written reports, no body cam footage, no audio recordings as required by protocol. Most notably, the name Troy Halberd appeared repeatedly as a statistical anomaly where data failed to match official records and witness testimony. A woman recounted being driven from a bus stop by Halberd in winter, left shivering between patrol cars without being allowed into the warming station. An elderly man said he was knocked down for not moving fast enough when ordered. Stories once buried under the label of maintaining order began to resurface one by one, word by word. Meanwhile, the police department's internal disciplinary board held an emergency hearing that stretched from afternoon into the early morning. The pressure from media and public scrutiny rendered the standard defenses ineffective when asked to explain multiple homeless-related incidents with no body cam footage. Halberd blamed technical errors, but the tech unit confirmed no system malfunctions during those times. One board member asked directly, "Have you routinely turned off your camera to avoid oversight?" Halberd didn't answer. His face tightened, the once defiant eyes now dulled with fatigue, as if even he couldn't believe how far this had unraveled. The final decision was delivered at dawn suspension without pay pending the final hearing. The board chair's closing remark landed like a cold verdict: your continued use of the badge under current conditions would destroy the integrity of the entire department. As soon as the news hit the front pages of major newspapers, public response spread immediately. People gathered outside the courthouse not with noise or chants, but holding signs that read, "Justice is the floor, not the ceiling," and "Protect the powerless, not the bad." Activists who once pushed for police reform returned to the airwaves, but this time they weren't talking about tweaking procedures. They called for a complete overhaul of how internal power is monitored. A sociology professor on local radio commented, "The current system confuses symbol with substance. A badge cannot obscure how it's being used." At the same time, an online petition demanding Halberd be prosecuted for abuse of power officially passed 500,000 signatures, becoming the largest petition in state history concerning law enforcement conduct. On the evening news, a reporter stood in front of the mural of Micah in New Orleans, a quiet line of people stretching behind her. She read slowly, "Today the question is no longer who was right or wrong, but why did wrong have to last this long before being seen? And who will suffer next if we stay silent again?" When the screen cut back to the studio, the anchor paused for a few seconds before speaking again, as if making space for the silence of millions watching. In the final segment, a young correspondent quoted Micah, "I'm not asking for my honor back. I'm asking that we stop stripping it from others." And as the lights in the square began to dim to close, the memorial vigil vigil, dozens still stood in place outside the courthouse where Troy Halberd would soon face his final trial. They didn't shout a single slogan, but their presence was the loudest answer to a system that once believed the powerless would always remain quiet. The courtroom that day was so full that every empty space had been taken not only by the relatives of those involved, but also by curious citizens, reporters with notebooks and recorders ready, and people who had followed the case from the very first day. The air was dense, as if the entire city had paused, focusing its gaze on a single room, waiting for an answer everyone knew would go far beyond the limits of an ordinary trial. The pale yellow light from the high-hanging bulbs fell across each face, glinting off the wrinkles of the elderly, the tense eyes of the young, and the deliberately neutral expressions of those trying to separate themselves from the shared emotion. In a corner, near the entrance, several people stood against the wall for lack of seats, arms folded, eyes shifting between the defendant's stand and the witness bench. On the wooden platform, Troy Halberd's lawyer stood. His light gray suit, neatly knotted tie, and face showed little expression, though his eyes held a calculated precision. He began in a low, steady voice, choosing each word as if laying down bricks. "My client is a police officer carrying out his duties within the bounds of his profession under the daily pressures of a dangerous environment. Every action stemmed from the intent to preserve order." Each sentence echoed in the space like a speech well rehearsed, yet not once did it mention Micah's name. Not once did it acknowledge the kick imprinted on his body, nor the blood that had seeped through 2 layers of shirt that day. The lawyer went on emphasizing each word. "The nature of this incident has been distorted by factors of media social emotion and unverified spread. To many in the room, the defense felt like an attempt to pack everything that had happened into a sealed box, label it misunderstanding, and push it away." The room fell silent. Some in the front row simply looked towards the man seated to the left of the defendant's stand. Micah Rourke sat there, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, fingers interlaced, knuckles white, as if trying to hold something inside, something that if released could sweep away all the composure he had fought to keep. When the presiding judge signaled, Micah rose slowly. He wore no uniform, no expensive suit, only a dark shirt and plain trousers. His build was lean but strong, his short hair revealing the sharp lines of his face. He did not look at Halberd, nor did he immediately face the jury. His gaze went toward some invisible point in the air where in his memory the invisible blows of prejudice had left cuts deeper than any physical injury. Then he spoke, his voice not loud but firm, pressed tight, as if each word had to pass through an inner barrier. "I've been in many places, faced situations harder than that day. But for the first time in my life, I understood there are battles that need no guns, no bullets, yet can still take everything from you." The whole room seemed to lean toward him, not only to hear better, but to measure the weight of the words. He paused for a beat, letting the silence speak the rest, then continued. "You speak about professional limits, but limits are not in procedures. They are not in thick law books or training clauses. They are in the human heart. They are in the choice of whether to step on someone who has already fallen." The last sentence landed like a blade cutting through the final layers of the defense's cover. Someone coughed lightly from the back row, as if reflexively trying to break the rising pressure, but the sound was swallowed in the thick silence. The presiding judge called for final remarks from the defendant. All eyes turned to Halberd. He did not stand. Head bowed, hands gripping the edge of the table as if holding on to something slipping away. For the first time since the trial began, Troy Halberd said nothing. No denial, no anger, not even the repeated "I'm innocent" heard over the past months. Between him and Micah was an unbridgeable space once filled with shouting and the stomp of boots on concrete. Now only the heavy silence of 2 men who had clashed in the dark of a street corner, now facing each other under the cold light of the law. The jury withdrew to deliberate. The wooden door closed with a dry sound. Time outside seemed to stretch. Those in the courtroom glanced at each other but spoke not a word, hands resting on laps. Long breaths exhaled, all waiting. Outside the courthouse, the crowd no longer shouted or held signs like in the early days. They stood still, as if waiting not only for a verdict on one man, but on an era everyone knew was wrong, yet few had the patience to see the end in truth. When the jury returned, there was no projection screen, no cue music, only the steady, decisive voice of the female judge. Troy Halberd is found guilty of abuse of power in the line of duty, causing serious injury and systematic violations of professional ethics. Sentencing will be on the 28th of next month. The air seemed to break in a wave of exhalations, mingled with a deeper silence from those still trying to grasp the meaning of what they had heard. Micah remained still. His arms hung at his sides, eyes unblinking on the empty space ahead, as if the sentence for him was not in the number of months or years of confinement, but in the moment a person realizes they can no longer hide behind a title to do wrong. As Halberd was led out of the courtroom, a high school student in the crowd suddenly raised a hand to wave at Micah. No one knew who the boy was, no name was called, but that look was enough to speak for generations. We saw, and we will not forget. Micah did not answer with a smile or a nod, but only walked through the final hallway of the courthouse. He did not turn back. He walked straight toward the exit where there were no cameras, no flashes, only a man moving with the posture of someone who had reclaimed his right to exist through his own silence. When the judge read the final provisions, the entire hall seemed to settle to the sound of every breath. The decision to permanently dismiss Troy Halberd from duty rang out like a full stop. He not only lost his title, but also all the power once attached to the badge that now held no value. The sentence added 12 months of community service, specifically cleaning streets and assisting at shelters for the homeless people he had once treated with brutality. Most importantly, Halberd was ordered to publicly read an apology not only before the media's cameras, but in front of those who had witnessed the moment he delivered a kick to a man who could no longer defend himself. The scratch of a pen marked the document as sealed. News spread quickly out of the courtroom, flowing into messages, phone calls, and online posts. But inside, everyone still seemed to wait for one thing, a reaction from Halberd. He remained standing, arms at his sides, eyes fixed on the wooden panel before him, offering no defense, no glance of remorse. Perhaps he knew that any words now would only deepen the emptiness swallowing him. Micah left the courtroom with steady steps, his head held high enough for the dim hallway light to touch his shoulders. He did not hurry, did not rush outside, did not look back at Halberd, did not smile in victory. That calm was stronger than any formal sentence, a silent declaration that he had passed the greatest test of his life. People still recalled how Halberd's kick had once driven Micah to the concrete, the breath forced from his lungs, the shouts erupting all around. But now it was Micah's composure and silence that struck harder than any blow, a quiet verdict against a power that had been abused for too long. Each step he took from the courtroom to the steps outside seemed to write the next part of another story, reminding all that anyone could be forced into helplessness if no one stood to prove the truth. The door of the courtroom closed behind him, the echo of the metal lock sounding like the end of a dark chapter, opening a chance for the city to reconsider how it treats the vulnerable. As he stepped outside, Micah drew in a deep breath. The air carried the scent of late afternoon Sun Street dust, and somewhere faintly the lingering antiseptic from the bandage wrapped around his wrist. He paused at the top of the steps, lifting his head to the sky as it shifted toward a shade of purple, the color of a day nearing its end, yet also signaling a new evening still and possibly more peaceful. At the rear exit of the courthouse, Halberd was escorted out. There were no lights, no cameras, only a few quiet witnesses. His shoulders trembled slightly, unclear whether from fatigue or from the weight of the apology hanging ahead of him. Justice, as many would say later, had arrived at the right time, but to those who truly understood, the real strength did not lie in the sentence or the number of months of community service. It lay in the fact that the victim had the courage to move past his wounds, to stand still in silence, so the whole world could see the value of restraint instead of displaying power through violence. The moment the public was still watching the image of Micah stepping out of the courtroom, a wave of accounts from anonymous throwaways to verified profiles posted the same status at "Once I was Micah." 4 short words free of ornament, yet they spread like wildfire across every platform. It was not a casual share your feelings line. It quickly became a collective message, a mirror in which millions saw themselves. Anyone who had ever been pushed to society's margins, forced to leave a public bench without cause, or had their every step locked under a stranger's wary gaze, found a sharp, unshakable resonance in his story. Evening news broadcasts immediately placed the hashtag #IamMicah in their headline. The phrase appeared on LED screens of high-rise buildings, on bus stop billboards, on flyers taped hurriedly to street corners. From crowded markets full of shouts and haggling to shipping containers lined up at the docks, from subway stations heavy with the scent of metal and machine oil to the city square that once hosted parades everywhere, there were white posters with bold black letters, "Equal right to live for all." Just below, in smaller print, but carrying farther than 1,000 speeches, was the slogan, "The People's Court does not only judge the offender, it teaches people how to treat each other." On Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, each platform became an open square where people who had never met Micah in real life freely shared their own memories. They spoke of being yelled at by police for simply walking home on a winter night, of an afternoon when they were told to leave a park bench for wearing a hooded sweatshirt, of being herded off a sidewalk in a crowd without a single word of explanation. Many of these moments seemed ordinary in isolation, yet together they formed a portrait of suspicion and prejudice woven so deeply into daily life that it went unnoticed until now. By the end of the third day after the trial, a shared idea emerged across major cities. People didn't put up new prohibition signs, but instead restored the old ones with a simple line: "Public space means for everyone." The words were carved deep, painted white or yellow to stand out against green or blue backgrounds, placed at park entrances, bus stops, train stations, and even in commercial districts where random ID checks had once been accepted as a normal part of life. These signs were not decorations. They were blunt reminders that common space cannot be turned into a zone of privilege for a select few, and certainly not into a stage for individuals to display their power. This spread was no longer tied to the name Micah Rourke as an individual, but had become a shared symbol, a name representing all who had ever faced abuse of power. People began recording every day yet haunting stories. A boy repairing a bicycle on the roadside was shoved down by police under suspicion of theft. An elderly woman selling vegetables was forced to show papers right at her stall. An art student was ordered to open her bag in the middle of the street simply because she looked suspicious. Each story, however small, was a fragment of the larger picture of a kind of power more accustomed to imposing fear than ensuring safety. In just 1 week, hundreds of such accounts were compiled into an e-book titled "Say Who You Used to Be." Released for free, it gathered writing, photographs, and short clips capturing moments when people's citizenship was challenged. It was not a glossy publication, yet within hours of being posted, it drew hundreds of thousands of downloads. Some videos were shaky images, blurred audio imperfect, but their truth cut sharper than any editing technique could. This current of social media left local leaders unable to look away. Some mayors who had previously answered the press with vague statements now had to announce plans to review the entire process of citizen stops. They promised mandatory body cameras for all officers and regular public forums with civil groups on the right to free movement and the right to exist in public spaces without being treated as suspects. These measures, though still met with skepticism, showed one thing. The signs reading public space means for everyone had gone beyond being slogans. They had become mirrors for each city to examine itself to ask whether its streets, parks, and stations were truly open to all or still bounded by an invisible line. The heart of the movement was not politicians or career activists, but nameless, titleless people willing to speak. I was Micah. I was forced off a bench. They did not need an organization behind them, nor did they wait for permission to speak. These statements were like a test posed to society. Could any law or internal code ignore millions of small lives yearning to be acknowledged? And when the sign, public space, means for everyone, was raised before the eyes of all, it was no longer a symbolic image. It was a living declaration that justice could not remain on paper, but had to flow through the daily lifeblood of equality between human beings. Amid the swell of public attention, an envelope arrived at the Witness Intake Center, the address handwritten, postmarked from a state hundreds of miles away. Inside was a letter written in blue ink, the slanted script steady and deliberate. The sender was a female police officer who had spent many years in a street security unit and had recently left the force after a series of scandals within her local department. She began her letter. Dear Micah Rourke, I have reviewed the entire case file and listened to every word you spoke in court. I want to thank you for keeping the right kind of silence. She wrote that she had once felt paralyzed watching colleagues turn power into an excuse to intimidate the innocent. She had stayed silent, afraid her voice would never shake a system so used to operate in that way. Then you walked into the courtroom, she continued, and your silence was not avoidance but a way of proving that every act, no matter how small, can unsettle an entire system. At the end, she included an old photograph of Micah standing next to a group of community patrol officers during a local patrol campaign. In it, he wore a light jacket, his gaze straight into the camera, calm, but not cold, as if he understood both the fragility and the weight of the moment being captured. Beneath the photo, she had written, to remind you that even when they accused you of loitering, causing trouble, you were still the one holding justice in the smallest of details. Micah sat in the small room of the center, afternoon light falling through the window frame, quietly reading every word. His finger brushed lightly over the blue ink, pausing at the final line, but he spoke no reply. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into the pocket of his faded jacket, a jacket still carrying the scent of wind and street dust from the nights he had walked home through darkened blocks. Then he stood, leaving the center with slow measured steps, as if each one weighed something beyond the case itself. The next morning, before the city had fully woken, Micah passed by the old park. Once unknown to most, it had been the site of the kick that brought him down. He saw the bench had been replaced, the concrete a lighter shade, but the brick-clad lamppost remained. He walked up, placed his hand on the cold metal where that night he had leaned back to hold in tears under the harsh glow of the streetlight on a bewildered face. The sound of buses drifted in from the main road, but here, between the rustle of fallen leaves and the rhythm of his own breathing, he heard only silence. There was no audience, no camera lens, no hashtag, no signboard, just him, the lamppost, and memory. He did not linger long, but when he left, he knew with certainty that the silence of that night had not been born of helplessness, but from the understanding that sometimes silence carries more weight than words enough to expose every hollow space where prejudice had once crawled and taken root. The wave of outrage following the verdict against Troy Halberd did not subside when the courtroom doors closed. It quickly moved beyond the scope of a single case, spreading into a political and legal earthquake that forced the Federal Department of Justice to formally launch a large-scale investigation. The file opened with a brief but weighty heading, Systemic Abuse of Power in County-Level Police Departments. This was not a vague accusation. It was a step-by-step plan to dismantle mechanisms that had existed for decades, where power was used to intimidate and suppress the homeless, the poor, and vulnerable groups without being subjected to any form of public oversight. Federal investigative teams were ordered to collect every internal report from the past 10 years from police departments under suspicion. They reviewed data storage procedures, examined every case ever classified as insufficient evidence or handled internally. Each case was brought into the open accompanied by demands for a full list of personnel involved. At the same time, subpoenas were issued to officials from all 3 states where Halbert had served, requiring them to account for training mechanisms, incident reporting protocols, and, in particular, internal oversight responsibilities. In this context, an independent commission was formed. Its members included not only government officials but also representatives from human rights organizations, civil liberties, attorneys, sociologists, and community delegates. After a series of tense meetings, the commission produced a groundbreaking proposal: mandatory recording in all interactions with vulnerable individuals. This was no longer a matter solely for the police force. The recommendation extended to community patrols, private security, or anyone granted the authority to impose control over a citizen's body or freedom. All without exception would be required to carry recording devices with geolocation timestamps, audio, and full panoramic video. The purpose was to ensure that all actions could be reviewed transparently and, when necessary, scrutinized directly by both the public and the courts. The proposal was accompanied by a detailed plan: use federal grant funding to equip personnel with next-generation body cameras capable of automatically backing up data to a secure, independently managed cloud system. The regulations also outlined strict penalties for any act of powering off the device, deleting files, or deliberately obstructing recording. When this information was released, it drew attention not only from the press and legal forums but also from city councils, which were forced to schedule urgent discussions. Public reaction came quickly and forcefully. In many major cities, mayors and councils immediately announced pilot programs. They pledged to start in areas with the highest number of reported abuse cases, turning those districts into transparency test zones with near-total body camera coverage. But the reaction from law enforcement itself split sharply into 2 opposing camps. Some veteran police officers argued that they would be over-monitored, with every gesture and word scrutinized, leading to heightened stress while on duty. Conversely, others admitted this was an inevitable step to restore public trust that had been severely eroded. Legal experts noted that if the regulation were passed, it would profoundly change the relationship between citizens and law enforcement. From now on, every touch, every request for identification, every temporary detention order would be recorded, not only to protect civilians but also to protect officers doing their jobs correctly from unfounded accusations. Yet, when the call for mandatory recording rang out, more critical questions emerged. Who gets to monitor whom, and are we truly building a transparent justice system where even the smallest actions are accountable to the public and the law? Those questions quickly became the focal point of panel discussions, live television programs, and closed-door meetings of the Independent Commission. Debates over the boundary between protection and control intensified by the day. Lawmakers, security experts, human rights advocates, and police leaders sat together, but no one left the room with a fully satisfactory answer. Supporters cited statistics: in the past 10 years, public trust in the police had dropped by more than 30%. They argued that when citizens no longer believe in words alone, they need direct evidence, unedited, uncut footage to feel safe and protected. In their view, cameras are not only all-seeing eyes for oversight, but it also shields against arbitrariness. Opponents, on the other hand, questioned how such massive volumes of data would be handled. They warned that a dense archive of video and audio from every police encounter could turn justice into a complicated numbers game. Those without technical knowledge or data analysis skills could easily get lost in the tangle manipulated by selectively chosen clips. Privacy experts worried that forcing every officer to wear a body camera meant every step they took would be scrutinized, potentially making them hesitant or worse, prompting them to stage situations favorable to their image. At this point, the line between protecting the community and controlling the individual became more fragile than ever. The police chief of a major city told the press they supported surveillance technology, but stressed the need for a clear legal framework to ensure data would not be abused. Meanwhile, human rights organizations proposed creating an independent agency to manage the storage and retrieval center instead of leaving it entirely in the hands of law enforcement. In their view, this was the only way to balance citizens' rights with the need to ensure public safety. But the question still hung in the air. How can we prevent either side, whether police or civilians, from turning cameras into weapons? Can a system truly be fair if the power to replay footage rests in the hands of only one party? And when everything's recorded, are we moving closer to justice or sliding into a fully surveilled society? Amid this controversy, an unexpected figure appeared at a local TEDx event. It was the man who had quietly gathered 3 different angles from Alley 4 footage that became critical evidence in the Micah Rourke case. He stepped onto the stage in a wrinkled shirt, holding the microphone as if it weighed more than usual. When the stage lights hit him, he said that his silence in the past when he witnessed Micah being beaten by Halberd had unintentionally helped injustice take root. Sometimes, he paused, scanning the room, all you have to do is stand still and not turn off the camera, so the world knows who's really doing their job and who's forgotten the essence of protection. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried steadily and firmly as if nailing each word into the walls of the conference hall. That message left the audience silent for a few seconds. People realized the issue wasn't just about the camera, but about the awareness and ethics of the person holding it. A device can become a tool for transparency or a means of distorting the truth. It all depends on the operator's choice. When he left the stage, there was no thunderous applause. Instead came another kind of silence, the silence of understanding. And perhaps in that moment, the greatest question the entire system must confront was distilled into a single thought. Are we protecting each other, or are we controlling each other? Photojournalist Terry Vaughn was not the only one following the Micah Rourke case, but he was the only one standing at the exact moment when light and shadow met on the same wall. That afternoon, the sun was lowering, sending slanted rays from the southwest across the old streets of the South End. Micah stood at a street corner next to a red brick wall covered in graffiti blotches of color, hurried spray strokes, all coming together to form a massive portrait of himself. The mural was not the work of a single artist, but the result of many hands in the community. There were bold strokes from professional street painters, clumsy brush marks from high school students, and even bright splashes of paint, contributed by an elderly man from the nearby nursing home. In the painting, Micah's face was not looking straight ahead, but slightly turned, his gaze set beyond the reach of the lens as if listening and challenging at the same time. Terry pressed the shutter just as Micah stood motionless, his shadow stretching long across the mottled brick and partially overlapping with the shadow of the mural behind him. The two shadows, one of the real man and one of the painted image, merged into a single shape, flowing between fresh streaks of paint and broken lines. In that frame, the boundary between man and symbol nearly disappeared. The photograph exploded the moment Terry posted it on social media. His short caption, "Sometimes standing still is also a way to move," was shared tens of thousands of times within within hours. People saw in it not just an artistic moment, but a slice of history. A man once knocked to the pavement, now standing in the middle of the city with no trace of kicks or shouts, only absolute stillness. Many called the photo the embodiment of steadfastness in darkness. One comment read, "He's not standing before a court, not standing on a podium just in front of a wall. But right there, he's standing for all of us." Others recalled the legs that once trembled under violence, now standing firm as a challenge. The power of the image came not only from the contrast between shadow and light between Micah and the wall, but from the story that created it, a story of dozens of videos, emails, testimonies, and the faith of a community that fought to mend itself after a long night. When the editorial board of The Atlantic saw the photo, they knew instantly they had found the cover for the October issue. Against the image, the headline, "The Man Who Didn't Move," appeared like a declaration. Nothing can move a man who has chosen to stand on the side of what is right. Just below, a small caption served as the final explanation, "A man who refused to move so the world could see where it had gone wrong." On the day the magazine was released, the October cover flooded online platforms. In major cities, the image appeared on LED screens in central squares and on billboards at bustling intersections. On the street, passers-by slowed their steps when they caught Micah's painted gaze and his shadow in the afternoon sun. Some smiled, some lowered their heads as if offering an apology for what they had once overlooked. In the photo, Micah said nothing. His back was straight, his arms hung naturally, his eyes fixed forward as if looking through the lens toward something far on the horizon. He was like a silent lighthouse, no flashing, no calls yet. His light still guided those lost in the darkness of prejudice and violence. The Man Who Didn't Move quickly outgrew its role as a journalistic headline. It became the slogan of an entire movement: when you stand firm, the world itself will have to shift back. And the wall, painted with Micah's image, became living proof that sometimes the strongest way to change the world is not to walk 1,000 miles, but to hold your ground no matter how hard injustice tries to shove you aside. In another corner of the story, as the world buzzed over the photograph, Troy Halberd awoke before dawn. Since sentencing, each of his days began with the same rhythm: washing his face in the small bathroom, putting on a brown work uniform, pulling on yellowed rubber gloves, and stepping into the front yard of the nursing home. The police uniform that had once been his shield and symbol of authority had been taken away. In his hands, instead of a baton, was a long broom and an old metal dustpan. His morning work was to sweep fallen yellow leaves, gather trash into bins, and wash the tiled walkway leading from the gate to the common room. Those motions for a man once trained in the quick reflexes of police work had become slow and steady to the point of meditation. But inside Halberd there was none of the steadiness he once had. Each sweep of the broom was a beat of the sentence, permanent suspension, community service, and most of all the loss of the right to look at others from above. On some mornings, when the first sunlight streamed through the window and fell across the back of his shirt printed with the words "Community Service," Halberd recalled the final hearing. He remembered Micah's word. The limit isn't in the bad, it's in the heart. First, it had felt like an attack, but over time it became a persistent echo threading through each step he took across the yard, each trash bin filled. During this time, he was not allowed to wear a uniform, nor was he allowed to carry a weapon. The simple labor forced him to face a bare reality. Without power, he was simply a man, and his worth lay in how he treated others. Sometimes a few elderly residents would step out from the dining hall, leaning on canes or walkers. They would give him a faint smile, not overly friendly, but enough for him to recognize the change. Some had once been fearful at the sight of him in uniform, but now they saw only a man quietly sweeping the yard of their home. When the Atlantic cover featuring Micah's image flooded newspapers and social media, Halberd saw it too. To him, the photograph was not merely the emblem of a movement. It was a mirror reflecting the collapse of the power he had once believed untouchable. Each time he bent to sweep leaves, the rasp of the broom against the dry concrete struck like the beat of memory, the beat of the kick he had once driven into Micah, the beat of the city that shook afterward. One morning, as he was sweeping leaves into a corner of the yard, a boy of about 8 ran in through the gate, his small shoes leaving muddy prints across the damp concrete. The boy stopped in front of Halberd, holding a warm loaf of bread still wrapped in paper. His wide eyes were filled with curiosity. "I saw you in a video," the boy said, his voice clear. Mom said never to look at someone with only half the truth. Then, without waiting for a response, he held out the loaf of bread. Halberd froze. In that instant, every memory of batons, hand toughs, shouts, the pounding of feet in pursuit seemed stripped away. All that remained was the slight tremor in his hand and the warmth of the bread seeping through the thin paper. The elderly residents sitting near the common room windows looked out, but none stopped the boy. They simply watched in silence. One tilted their head, as if wondering whether this moment might be a form of reconciliation. Halberd took the bread, hesitated, then murmured a thank you, his voice unsteady. The boy smiled, turned, and ran toward the playground. The small, damp footprints vanished behind the line of eucalyptus trees along the road. He stood still for a long while. A light wind stirred, lifting a few remaining yellow leaves from the yard. In his hands, the bread slowly cooled, but its warmth had sunk deep into a place he had never expected. Perhaps he thought this was the most genuine apology he had ever received, and also a reminder that the story had not ended in the courtroom. Community service was not just a punishment. It was the path he had to keep walking one step at a time to restore the trust of those who had once felt fear at the sight of him in uniform. And perhaps one day he would be able to stand firm before a wall, not to guard his own power, but to protect someone else. When he returned to his broom, the sound of sweeping leaves blended with the wind, neither loud nor showy. The nursing home remained quiet, leaving only the image of a man and the lines of eucalyptus shadows falling across the brick where past and future had just touched, silent yet profound. One early morning in the first week of the month at the Central Park, where countless unhoused individuals had once been driven away simply for daring to sit on a bench, a wooden sign appeared next to a newly painted row of Hope green benches. It read, "Rourke's Bench," the homeless support initiative bearing the same name officially launched. Benches were placed throughout the park with one simple, powerful rule. Anyone had the right to sit without harassment, without needing to show ID, without enduring shouts or looks of contempt. At the opening ceremony, Micah stood under the flash of dozens of cameras like a living witness. He stepped forward, gently touched the bench's surface, and spoke into the mic with a calm voice. "This isn't just a bench, it's a promise that everyone deserves a place to pause, no matter where life has put them." From the edge of the stage, hundreds of unhoused individuals began to sit, eyes wide with surprise and emotion. Across the street, the first members of a cohort of former officers enrolled in a bias reform program slowly joined the crowd. Each carried with them the rigid habits of the past, now called to sit beside those they had once forced out of the park. They wore no uniforms, only a small placard draped over their shoulders with their names, and the words "Rourke's Bench Participant." They touched the same bench, listened as unhoused individuals shared stories of fear and humiliation. One probationary officer looked down at his hands, calloused from years of baton drills, now silent. They were learning to accept that authority does not always place one on the right side of justice. Under the broad canopy of tropical almond trees, psychologists and volunteers handed out water and bread while talking with former officers, helping them understand that homelessness was not merely a bureaucratic issue, but a symptom of moral absence in us all. The question, "Why did you chase me away?" asked by a man with nowhere to sleep, became a trigger for deep personal reckoning. The program went beyond sharing space. It hosted testimony forums where both sides shared lived experiences and learned to understand each other. Tears slid down the cheeks of former officers as they heard Micah describe the fear of being shaken awake at night for having nowhere else to go. There were soft, rounds of applause when for the first time in years a homeless person was offered a shared cup of water by someone in an old uniform. City by city plans were discussed to replicate the model. Some places introduced shuttle buses to take the unhoused to Rourke's bench stations. Others opened life skills workshops with participation from former officers, creating spaces of equality between those who once wore uniforms and those once pushed to the margins. The phrase, "Everyone deserves a place to sit," spread like a slogan printed on T-shirts. Local artists stayed behind to paint portraits of the unhoused directly onto the benches, while former officers painted scenes of patrols filled with empathy to remind themselves that duty wasn't just about control but understanding. As sunset fell, Rourke's bench lit up with them all LED lights around the benches, their warm glow illuminating the faces of people rediscovering their dignity. Micah walked slowly along the row of seats, nodding to each person. An elderly woman quickly wiped away tears when she saw his silhouette reflected on the bench. A young homeless boy gently tapped the shoulder of a young officer sitting next to him as if to say they were now co-writing a new story, not just for one person, but for an entire community. Micah stepped onto the lecture stage at the law school to quiet applause from students and professors. The hall lights dimmed as he began to speak. "I didn't seek revenge. I just kept living like I still had worth." The sentence rang out like a victory cry and not lit by anger, but by a steady belief in self-worth. The auditorium was so silent that only the soft hum of the air conditioner and the breaths of former students could be heard. Micah's speech reached beyond his own story to offer a new vision of justice and dignity. He spoke of nights lost in the shadows of homelessness, of the kick he endured as one more brick in the wall of prejudice, but more importantly, he spoke of how he persisted step by step to assert that every human being has worth, not because of a badge or a title, but because the right to live, to be seen, to be respected, has belonged to us since birth. His voice was gentle but firm as he spoke about Rourke's bench, a place where public space was redefined to reject the symbol of abusive authority and welcome the weary. As he ended his talk with a reminder that persistence can change the way a society sees people, the applause erupted not for the conclusion of a performance, but for the awakening as hundreds of eyes realized they had once overlooked the value of those hidden behind prejudice. Just outside the building, beneath the rustling shade of an old tree, a group of volunteers had finished engraving the words, "Being seen is not a privilege, it's a birthright," onto a public stone bench painted in hopeful green. The deep carvings etched into the surface like a daily reminder to anyone stopping to rest that being seen is not a privilege for the few, but a right every person is born with. Sunset spread across the park, the bench casting a long shadow over the brick walkway, the sound of children's laughter and distant footsteps blending with that immortal message. Those who were once invisible could now sit there even if the scuffs and scratches on the bench bore marks of hardship. Each piece of that stone bench became a living record, a reminder that change doesn't come from one person, one event, or one trial, but from millions of moments when individuals choose to see each other with equal belief in human dignity. And just like that, Rourke's bench became more than a support program for the unhoused. It became a symbol of collective transformation where every seat told a story about the unshakable worth of every human being. Micah quietly packed his things and left the city at dawn. The streets were empty, lit only by a few flickering streetlights reflecting on the dew-soaked pavement. People heard the window of the old apartment shut behind him. The small window facing the Rourke's Bench Memorial Garden no longer held the familiar silhouette. No one saw him board a train or step onto a bus. Only a final photo remained, sent by a volunteer to the Homeless Support Network. It showed Micah sitting still on a public bench in the park, morning light filtering through the trees, his eyes looking straight into the lens as if to deliver an unspoken message that human worth is not confined by geography. That moment became a silent artifact of the journey he chose, not an escape, but a movement to continue proving the right to exist anywhere. The image quickly spread across social media. The community followed with emotional comments, including one short, powerful message: he disappeared not to hide, but because we finally saw him. That line was shared thousands of times as a collective declaration for anyone who had ever felt invisible. His departure wasn't an act of retreat, but the beginning of a new horizon where every step he took lit up a path in the collective memory. No one knew whether he headed to a mountain town or a riverside camp where the sunsets lingered longer, but his image in that photo confirmed the story would not end with a name. It would live on in awakened hearts and eyes that now paused to truly see each other. People began installing fake cameras outside parks, identical in shape to real surveillance devices, but incapable of recording, meant only to remind everyone that every gesture falls within the reach of conscience. Across lampposts throughout the city, a sign began to appear: "You are being watched by your own conscience." Simple words, powerful enough to stir anyone walking past, making each step, each decision resonate not just with legal accountability, but with communal responsibility. Meanwhile, the trace of Micah seemed to linger on old walls, where murals of his face remained fresh day after day, reminding all of the strength found in persistence and compassion. The fake camera campaign spread quickly across cities, not just in parks, but in front of government buildings, bus stops, even cafes, where Micah had once been shoved as a silent reminder that each of us holds the power to observe, reflect, and change. Even in the smallest neighborhoods outside school gates, parents began hanging signs that read, "You are being watched by your own conscience," as a way to teach the next generation that justice is not just a theory, but a daily responsibility. The fake cameras, with their unblinking artificial eyes, became symbols of collective moral surveillance, nudging people not to turn away from injustice. Social activists documented the movement, posting images of the signs and cameras online with the message, "Be the watcher before you become the watched." The words spread rapidly, forming a nameless yet powerful movement. While the fake cameras reassured the conscience, people came to understand that watching wasn't about punishment but about awakening, turning justice into a shared path where everyone becomes a witness for one another. On corners where Micah had once been kicked to the curb, flower pots and warm yellow streetlights were added as signs of hope, places where anyone passing by could pause, look into a stranger's eyes, and ask themselves what they had done to stop violence. These small but meaningful gestures grew into a civil movement, awakening awareness of personal accountability. In the end, the story didn't close with a verdict or Micah's absence, but in the heart of every citizen. Before leaving the park each evening, people would glance up at the fake camera and pause for a second, silently asking if no agency intervenes. Will I rise to defend the vulnerable or walk away in silence? That act, tied to a simple sign, became a more vivid reminder than any law. It placed the burden of observation and action directly on the individual. And as the final streetlight dimmed with only the faint glow of those silent eyes left in the dark, one last unspoken question hung unmistakably in the air. If no one is watching, who will stop the next kick? The quiet afternoon when Martin Hayes first left the scene became a symbol of a revolution in human dignity. From the moment he stood in a black suit before a shuttered bookstore offering no arguments, only presence, a current of re-examined prejudice began to flow, awakening people to the truth that anyone can become a victim when power goes unchecked. Young officer Troy Halberd, once convinced he could enforce authority through kicks, slowly learned that protecting the community doesn't mean turning homeless citizens into targets. Micah Rourke, the man who was kicked to the ground and later revealed to be a former elite soldier, rose from physical pain and spiritual injury to become a banner for change until the silent cry. If no one is watching, Who will stop the next kick echoed across Reddit threads, the hashtag @Micah Rourke, and international media. The images shared rapidly from citizens' phones and community-installed fake cameras outside parks, bus stops, and corner stores reignited a shared conscience. The story stretched across nearly 20 chapters, from the moment Martin Hayes stood waiting by a reflective window, questioned without cause by 2 white officers, to the arrival of State Security Director Richard Langston, who suspended Halbert and his accomplice, launching a wave of internal investigations, leaked files, the belated apology letter from former officer Greg Sutherland, the confession of Professor Elijah Moore, and Lieutenant Nora Ellison's public address. Each moment peeled back layers of long-buried prejudice. Case files once shelved in back archives, audits scrubbed clean, incomplete incident reports, all were brought to light when the Civic Light Initiative published them, pushing for a 10-year data declassification order. The turning point came when veteran Micah appeared as a witness, his quiet gaze shifting the tone of the trial as a retired colonel affirmed his resilience in the Northern Mosul campaign, and military footage showed a man who had always backed his team, now absurdly cast as a faceless victim. The legal system had to confront a fundamental question: where is the boundary between the power to protect and the abuse of it, and who watches the protectors? The final jury ruled Halbert's actions as systemic abuse of authority, resulting in permanent suspension, a sentence of 12 months of community labor, and a mandate to issue a public apology. After the trial, Micah stepped into the sunset calm as when he was first kicked to the ground, silently declaring that he didn't need anyone to kneel. He needed them to understand that the kick represented a generation that had never received an apology. That message drove thousands of citizens to post signs reading, "Being poor is not a crime," outside government offices, to declare "I was once Micah" on social media, and to hang "Public space means for all" plaques on city lampposts. Murals of Micah's portrait appeared in New Orleans, New York, and Los Angeles with the words, "I knelt not to beg, but to breathe," stirring public empathy. Human rights organizations demanded a re-examination of how homeless individuals were handled, a sweep of storage loopholes and data systems, and mandatory video recording of all interactions involving the vulnerable. The national debate exploded over the thin, volatile line between protection and control, as the anonymous witness Obsidian 197 revealed 3 separate videos from a rooftop, a bus cam, and across the street capturing Halbert's voice admitting, "I do this every week," prompting the council to conclude that his actions were systemic, not isolated. From the pain of someone no longer present, Micah had become proof of abuse buried in plain sight. When Micah was finally found in a tent deep in the woods, eyes still distant, his walk into the courtroom in plain clothes cast a hush over the room. Halbert lowered his head during the hearing, facing the man he once called garbage. As Micah said, "I don't need you to kneel, I need you to understand that kick came from an entire generation that's never been apologized to." Micah's voice affirmed that courage doesn't come from force, but from choosing silence wisely, knowing that a fair fight begins with understanding. When the retired colonel emphasized that Micah once saved teammates in a fire corridor, and training footage showed him quietly but effectively guiding new recruits, the review board went, still admitting that his response, "Under assault, I knew I was on a different battlefield," revealed his enduring resilience. Court records showed that over 8 years, Halbert had 34 encounters with homeless individuals, 29 of which had no body cam footage, prompting Micah's sharp question, who monitors these encounters? When the police department admitted procedural data storage failures, the crowd outside the courthouse raised signs reading, "Being poor is not a crime," a warning that the system must answer to the vulnerable. The account Obsidian 197, a law student who had witnessed the assault, appeared in court and said, "I'm not a hero, I was just afraid I'd forget what was right. When Halberd tried to dismiss the footage by saying, "That's not clearly my face," GPS data from his radio synced with the moment, locking in the proof. The board's preliminary ruling the abuse was systemic. The Rourke justice movement surged past 4 million mentions, with CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera all covering the case as murals bearing the words, "I knelt not to beg, but to breathe," spread across cities carrying waves of shared reckoning. The civil movement grew as Rourke's bench was established, a homeless support program named after Micah, where those without shelter were welcomed, not driven away. Former officers enrolled in reform programs sat side by side with the very people they once displaced, opening space for honest dialogue. Micah was invited to speak at the law school, where he said, "I didn't seek revenge. I just kept living as if I still mattered," a line later engraved on a public bench. Being seen is not a privilege, it's a birthright, becoming an unspoken charter of dignity. In the end, Micah left the city in silence, leaving behind only a photo of him sitting still, eyes fixed on the lens as if to send a message that his presence, brief though it was, had already awakened society. The line. He disappeared, not to hide, but because we finally saw him spread everywhere, a reminder that he chose to go only when the world finally recognized his worth. People hung signs reading, "You are being watched by your own conscience," near parks, a quiet pledge of moral self-surveillance, and the final question echoed loudest. If no one is watching, who will stop the next kick? A call, not just for law enforcement, but for every heart that still listens. From this story, we draw lessons that inspire. First, silence can be power, but silence chosen to witness and record the truth is stronger than any accusation. Second, the duty to protect does not belong only to those who wear a badge, but to all of society, where every citizen is a witness with both the right and the obligation to step in when injustice appears. Third, justice is not measured solely by law, but by the way we look at one another with empathy and respect for every human being, regardless of background, status, or circumstance. Lastly, lasting change is built from the smallest actions: a hand brushing against a park lamppost, a fake camera placed near a bench, a sign serving as a daily reminder, all merging into a current of awareness and hope. The story does not end with empty promises, but with real ongoing action programs supporting the homeless, retraining courses for law enforcement, mandatory recording policies, and a conscience movement that has never gone silent. When we ask, if no one is watching, who will stop the next kick, we begin to understand that each of us holds the responsibility to make sure the next victim is not forced into silence. This is not just Micah's story, or Martin's or Halberd's. It's the story of everyone who chooses to observe, to speak up, and to stand for human dignity, so that kick never happens again.